Growing up, I always had this nagging feeling that something about me just wasn't right. I figured if I kept my mouth shut, smiled more, or tried a little harder, maybe then my dad would finally care about me. But it didn't matter what I did, my father never looked at me the way he looked at my brothers. There was never any pride in his eyes when he glanced my way, never any warmth, just a cold, distant indifference. My name's Lisa, and for as long as I can remember, I was the one nobody really saw in my own family. My dad, Frank, wasn't the kind of guy who yelled or lost his temper. He didn't have to raise his voice. His silence said more than words ever could. When I brought home straight A's in middle school, he barely even acknowledged it. But if my brother Tyler managed to scrape by in a class he'd been failing, Dad would slap him on the back and say, "That's my boy." I was 12 when it really hit me. It was Father's Day and I'd spent hours making a card, covered it in glitter and stickers, wrote a poem just for him. After dinner, I handed it to him, my heart pounding with hope. He glanced at it, mumbled a quick, "Thanks," and turned right back to the game on TV. Not 5 minutes later, my brother Mason strolled in and tossed him a mug from the store that said, "Number 1 Dad," and Dad lit up like he'd just won the Super Bowl. I just stood there, still holding my card, wondering why what I did never seemed to be enough. That's how it always was, I just never measured up. Mason and Tyler were the stars of the show. Mason was the athlete, always breaking records and getting his name in the local paper. Tyler was the smooth talker, charming everyone from teachers to relatives to random strangers. Me. I was the quiet one, the moody kid who spent too much time alone, writing stories or sketching in my room. My mom tried to even things out sometimes. She'd hug me tight and whisper, "You're special too, sweetheart." But even she couldn't change the pecking order in our house. If Mason wanted the last slice of pizza, he got it. If Tyler needed cash, Dad handed it over without a second thought. I remember asking for a new sketchbook once and Dad just said, "Why bother? You'll give up halfway like you always do." That stung more than he'll ever know. At dinner, I'd sit there quietly while Dad asked my brothers about their dreams, their plans, their day. He never once asked me. If I tried to join in, I'd get a half-hearted grunt or a fake smile. Eventually, I learned to keep quiet and let the boys have their spotlight. But deep down, something was changing in me, not just sadness but a kind of anger, a stubborn drive I didn't have a name for yet. I started pushing myself harder, not because I thought he'd finally notice, but because I wanted to matter to someone, even if that someone was just me. I stopped chasing his approval. Instead, I focused on building a life he couldn't ignore, becoming someone he'd have to see whether he wanted to or not. I was done being the daughter nobody remembered. I made a promise to myself. One day he'd remember me not as the quiet girl he overlooked, but as the woman who turned everything upside down. If you'd ever walked into our house during the holidays, you'd probably think you'd stepped into a commercial for the perfect American family. There'd be laughter coming from the kitchen, my brothers tossing a football in the backyard, and Dad grinning with a beer in his hand. But I knew better. I knew what it felt like to be just a background character in someone else's highlight reel. My brothers Tyler and Mason were born to stand out, or at least that's how Dad made it seem. Tyler, the oldest, could charm just about anyone. He was the guy who never studied but still managed to pass with a wink and a grin. Dad absolutely adored him. They had their own inside jokes, matching fishing hats, and even a secret handshake they'd made up when Tyler was 10. I remember watching them from the hallway once as Tyler showed Dad a business idea he'd scribbled on a napkin. Dad looked at him like he'd just invented the cure for cancer. "Atta boy," he said, clapping him on the back. "You've got a leader's mind." Mason, the youngest, was the family's golden athlete. His shelves were packed with soccer trophies. Dad never missed a game, no matter the weather, and he'd yell from the sidelines like he was the team's coach. When Mason scored the winning goal, Dad threw a huge backyard party, barbecue, music, the whole neighborhood invited. I was there too, of course, setting out plates and cleaning up after everyone. I got a good job once when I got into the honors program. That was it. No party, no special dinner, just a quick comment over breakfast while Dad chewed his toast. "Honors, huh? That's nice." I stayed up late studying, took every class I could, and worked part-time jobs to pay for extra courses. I earned certificates, won quiet awards, even landed a scholarship, but none of it ever seemed to shine in his eyes the way my brother's achievements did. At family dinners, Dad would light up talking about Tyler's new business or Mason's training camp. If I mentioned my internship at a top firm, he'd just nod and turn right back to my brothers. "Anyway," he'd say, "Tyler, tell them about that investor meeting." The message couldn't have been clearer. They were the main act and I was just the intermission. But the hardest part? I never resented my brothers. They weren't mean to me. They loved being in the spotlight, sure, but they never pushed me out of it. That was all Dad. I just couldn't figure out why. I tried everything, being helpful, being independent, being successful. Nothing made a difference. Sometimes I wondered if he even realized how much his favoritism hurt me. Other times I was sure he knew and just didn't care. I kept telling myself to let it go, to focus on my own life, to stop needing his approval. But deep down I still longed for it. Just once I wanted to hear him say, "I'm proud of you, Lisa." Not because he felt obligated, but because he truly meant it. That moment never came. Instead, something else happened, something that would change everything, though not in the way he ever expected and definitely not in the way he wanted. This was supposed to be my big break. The moment that made all those sleepless nights, missed parties, and years of second-guessing myself finally worth it. I'd poured everything I had into my little startup. A digital platform I truly believed could shake up the local market. It wasn't just a business to me. It was every late night, every tear, every stubborn bit of hope I'd clung to, all rolled into one. I thought that maybe, just maybe, this would finally prove my worth beyond a shadow of a doubt. The launch event took place in this sharp, modern conference room downtown. The place filled up with investors, reporters, and industry folks, all looking at me with a mix of curiosity and expectation. When I stepped up to the podium, my hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. I started talking about my vision, the obstacles I'd faced, and the future I wanted to build with this platform. For the first time, I felt like people were really listening, like they actually saw me for what I'd accomplished, not just who I was related to. After my talk, the whole vibe in the room changed. People came up to shake my hand, offer congratulations, and I overheard a few seasoned investors saying good things about my work. I let myself relax for a second, standing off to the side, feeling a rare sense of pride. But that feeling didn't last long. A few days later, my family got together for a dinner that was supposed to be a celebration. These dinners were always a mix of showing off and keeping the family pecking order alive. The dining room was softly lit, and my brothers walked in with their usual swagger, swapping stories about their latest wins. The air was thick with the same old sense of who mattered most. When we sat down, Dad took his usual spot at the head of the table. The conversation flowed, but as always, it circled back to who had done what lately. I waited for a little recognition, maybe a nod or a kind word, but instead, Dad started rattling off my brother's achievements. "Mason hit his third home run this season," he said, beaming, and everyone laughed along. "And Tyler, I hear you closed another big deal." "That's fantastic, son." It was like he was reading from a script, and every line got the applause it was supposed to. I tried to speak up, clearing my throat and saying, "I just launched my own company," hoping for a moment in the spotlight. But before I could even finish, Dad waved me off with a casual, Yeah, we know you're busy, honey," like I just mentioned taking out the trash. The room went quiet for a second, but nobody picked up on what I was trying to share. That quick brush-off hit me like a punch. I remembered all the times I'd tried to share my small wins, only to have them drowned out by the noise of my brother's applause. Right then, the weight of every ignored effort, every compliment that never came, and every time I'd been overlooked just crashed down on me. Something inside me snapped, but not in a way that made me angry, more like a sudden, sharp clarity. I realized that no matter how high I climbed or what I achieved, I'd never get the recognition I wanted from my dad. In that moment, I knew I couldn't keep playing the background character in my own story. I was going to build a life so bright, so undeniable that he couldn't look away. And if he kept trying to steal my moments, maybe he'd finally have to face what his favoritism had done. After that night, something in me just switched off, not out of bitterness but out of understanding. I stopped trying to win him over. I didn't argue, didn't explain myself, didn't ask to be noticed anymore. I just got quiet. I started skipping family gatherings, spending more time alone with my work and my thoughts. I moved out of the city, found a small, peaceful apartment on the edge of town, and threw myself into my business like it was the only thing keeping me alive. My startup, the one my family barely noticed, became my whole world. Money was tight at first. There were weeks when dinner was nothing but toast and instant coffee. I picked up freelance gigs just to keep the lights on. Some nights, I'd cry quietly under my desk, wondering if I was cut out for any of this. But every time doubt crept in, I found a little spark of determination. I didn't have anyone cheering me on, but I was finally doing something for myself. I learned how to fix bugs, pitch ideas, handle rejection, and chase down clients with a kind of grit only someone who's been overlooked could understand. There were nights when I'd scroll through social media and see Tyler at some business event with Dad by his side, or Mason holding up another trophy with a caption about making the family proud. It hurt like reopening an old wound, but I didn't let it stop me. I'd take a deep breath, put my phone down and get back to work. My success wasn't going to come from applause, it was going to come from not giving up. I grew in the quiet with no big announcements, no family updates, just long nights, stubborn effort, and the occasional client telling me, "You're the only one who really listened." Those words meant more to me than anything my dad could have said because they were real. A year later, things started to change. The company picked up steam, our user base grew, and a niche investor decided to take a chance on us. I finally hired a small team, folks who, like me, knew what it felt like to be underestimated. Together we built something amazing. But I kept my head down. I didn't send out holiday emails or show up at family dinners bragging about my success. I let them think I was still the quiet girl in the background. That's how I wanted it. But inside, everything was different. I stood taller, spoke with more confidence, and stopped shrinking myself to fit into someone else's story. I didn't need their approval anymore. I'd found something better, I'd found myself. For the first time, I made choices without second-guessing. I bought my first car on my own. I signed a lease for a bright, modern office with huge windows, and I did it without waiting for anyone to pat me on the back. I became the woman I used to dream about, the one I thought I had to become for them. But now I was doing it for me. And in all that quiet, I was building something more important than a career. I was building my own freedom. I'll never forget the first time I caught my reflection in a mirror and didn't immediately look away. The woman staring back at me wasn't the overlooked daughter anymore. She was someone who had fought her way out of the shadows and built a life on her own terms. There was nothing flashy about it, just a quiet, steady strength that didn't need to shout to be noticed. And soon enough, they wouldn't be able to look past me, not after what I was about to do. It had been nearly 2 years since I'd set foot in my childhood home. I skipped birthdays, holidays, and even those half-hearted phone calls that used to feel like an obligation. The silence went both ways. Nobody reached out to see how I was doing, and honestly, I didn't expect them to. That's the thing about being left out for so long, you get used to your own absence. But this year I made a choice. I sent a simple RSVP to the family group chat for the annual Father's Day dinner. No explanations, no extra words, just, "I'll be there." The responses were a weird mix of emojis and awkward silence. I could practically feel the discomfort through my phone. The night before the dinner, I stood in a dealership, pen in hand, signing the paperwork for a sleek black luxury car. I used the new last name I'd taken after my business took off, one my family wouldn't even recognize. They'd never bothered to ask what I was up to or who I was becoming. Next to me was a small, elegant black envelope, the kind of paper that feels heavy and important. Inside was a single legal document that would turn everything upside down. Father's Day came. I got dressed with care, not to impress anyone else, but to remind myself of who I'd become. Every piece of clothing felt like a layer of confidence, every step out the door a statement. When I pulled up to the house, the car's engine purred, almost like a warning. My brothers were already out on the patio, laughing and clinking glasses. Dad sat at the head of the table, grinning, drink in hand, playing the role of king among his sons. When he saw me, his face flickered with confusion before he put on a smile. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," he said. Heads turned, and I could feel the surprise and judgment settle over the group. I just smiled and said, "Hi everyone. Happy Father's Day, Dad." Dinner was the usual blend of forced laughter and subtle digs. Tyler went on about his new condo, Mason bragged about his latest promotion, and Dad soaked it all in, beaming like he'd won the lottery. Then the moment came. I stood up, slow and steady, and the room quieted. "I brought something for you," I said, locking eyes with Dad. I walked outside, leaving the door open behind me, and drove the luxury car right up to the front of the house, sleek, black, impossible to ignore. I got out, walked back inside, and placed the black envelope on the table in front of him. "For you, Dad. Happy Father's Day." A wave of gasps swept through the room. Tyler squinted at the driveway. "Is that a car?" Mason leaned in, eyes wide. "Wait, you bought that?" Dad stared at the keys, then at me, completely thrown off. His hands shook a little as he picked up the envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "Just open it," I replied, my voice calm and even. Everyone leaned closer as he slid the paper out. For a moment his face didn't change. Then his eyes darted across the page and I watched the color drain from his cheeks, his jaw tightening. "What is this?" he snapped, glaring at me now. I gave him a long, steady smile. "Read it carefully. You'll understand." And with that I walked out the door and got into the car. I drove away as the shouting started behind me because that envelope wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the ownership document for the company that had just bought out the firm where he worked. His job, his pride, his reputation, now all under my control. Happy Father's Day, Dad. The house hadn't changed a bit, still perfectly decorated, spotless and cold. My mother floated in and out of the dining room, quietly refilling glasses and smiling at jokes that didn't land. My brothers were already a few drinks deep, and the air was thick with old routines and unspoken rules. I sat at the end of the table, the black envelope heavy in my purse, its weight like a second heartbeat. The car keys were tucked safely in my coat pocket, the car itself parked right outside the window for everyone to see. The conversations swirled around me like I was invisible. Mason talked about his latest investment win, Tyler made jokes about people who still rent, and Dad nodded along, soaking up the pride like it was sunshine. "So how's business, Dad?" Tyler asked, raising his glass. Dad chuckled. "Busy as ever, but not everyone's cut out for this kind of pressure. Takes real backbone." He looked at Mason. "Good thing I've got two sons who know how to lead." I arched an eyebrow but kept quiet. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. Then Dad looked down the table at me and I could feel the shift in the room before he even spoke. "And then there's the loser at the end of the table," he said, gesturing toward me with a smirk. "Still playing the black sheep, huh?" The laughter exploded. Tyler nearly spit out his drink, Mason slapped the table, and the whole room seemed to shake with their amusement. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I didn't flinch, didn't smile, just waited. When the laughter finally faded, I stood up, slow and calm like someone who already knows how the story ends. "I actually brought you something, Dad," I said, pulling the envelope from my purse. "A little Father's Day gift." The room went silent, even the air seemed to freeze. I walked the length of the table and set the envelope right in front of him. He looked at it, confused. "What is this?" he asked. "Just open it," I said, then stepped back and crossed my arms. He tore open the envelope with a dramatic flourish, probably expecting a joke or maybe some cash. As he unfolded the paper and started reading, I watched the color drain from his face, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally a slow, dawning horror. What is this?" he stammered, his eyes narrowing as he looked up at me. I kept my voice steady and low. "You remember Summit Dynamics? The company you've been working at for the last decade." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Well, it's got new owners now." A beat passed. "I bought it," I said, my tone calm. "It was a silent acquisition. The deal went through last week." The silence that followed was so thick it felt like the whole room had stopped breathing. I leaned in just a little and added, "So no, I'm not the loser at this table. I'm the woman who just became your boss's boss." His mouth opened but nothing came out. Tyler looked like he'd seen a ghost. Mason's fork slipped from his hand and clattered onto his plate. "And that car out front?" I nodded toward the window. "That was part of the presentation, but I'll be taking it with me." I didn't wait for anyone's reaction. I turned, walked outside and slid behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, and as I pulled away I heard it, his scream echoing from the front door. It wasn't anger this time. It was fear. The car's engine purred as I drove away, my eyes locked on the road ahead. The weight of what I'd just done pressed against my chest, but it wasn't about payback anymore. It was about something deeper. For years I'd let myself fade into the background of a family that never really saw me, but now I was standing tall, casting a shadow they couldn't ignore. Still, the gravity of the moment wasn't the only thing on my mind. I could picture exactly what was happening back in that dining room as if I were still sitting there. I wasn't present anymore, but my actions would echo louder than any words I could have spoken. Inside, my father's hands shook as he clutched the document. He looked from the paper to his sons, his lips moving, searching for words that wouldn't come. Panic was spreading through him, tightening every muscle, crawling up his spine. "Dad." Tyler's voice was suddenly small. He got up and moved closer, trying to read over Dad's shoulder. "What's going on?" Mason, usually so sure of himself, was already on his feet, craning his neck to see the paper. "What is that? Wait, is that real?" Dad didn't answer. His eyes were glued to the document, his fingers tracing the lines but not really understanding. The words were simple, but to him they might as well have been a death sentence. I could almost hear the panic and confusion swirling around the table, their questions, their disbelief, their desperate need for answers. They'd always looked to him for guidance. Now he was just as lost as they were. Finally, Tyler couldn't take the silence anymore. Dad, what does it say? What's happening? Dad looked up, pale and shaken, his mouth opening and closing like he was struggling to breathe. It's a transfer of property, he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. A reversal of assets. All of it, the company, the house, my shares. His panic was obvious. Both sons froze. Mason stared wide-eyed. Wait, you're saying this paper means she owns everything? The realization hit them like a slap. The silence in the room turned from awkward to suffocating. My father, the man they'd always seen as unshakable, was now crumbling right in front of them. His sons had no idea how to process it. Tyler stumbled back, his face flushed with anger. How could she do this? He spat, his voice rising. She's nothing. We're the ones who worked for this. How could she? Dad raised a trembling hand, still trying to wrap his mind around what had happened. She's not nothing, he said, his voice breaking. She's everything. Mason's brow furrowed, his confidence gone. What do you mean, Dad? How could she? She owns it all, Dad whispered, barely able to get the words out. She owns the company, the house, everything. Everything I worked for. It's hers now. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. The sons who had always looked up to their father, who saw him as the king of their world, were now staring at a reality they couldn't even begin to understand. They'd never even considered me a threat. To them, I was just the shadow, the one who never measured up. But now I was the one holding all the cards. I don't get it, Tyler said, his voice shaking. How could she? When did this happen? Why didn't we know? Dad finally looked up, his face hollowed out by defeat. She didn't want you to know. She didn't have to tell you. She doesn't need us. Mason stepped back, trying to steady himself, searching for some explanation. But how did she pull this off? How did she get all of this? He asked, his voice shaky. Dad's reply was cold, almost bitter. She never asked for a thing, he said. She just went out and took it. The whole room was locked in stunned silence, the shock of my quiet, methodical rise finally sinking in. For the first time, my brothers had to face a truth they'd ignored for years. I wasn't the failure they'd always assumed. I was the one who'd put in the work, quietly, without applause or anyone cheering me on, and now everything they'd taken for granted belonged to me. My father let out a long, broken sigh. She's a lot smarter than I ever gave her credit for, he muttered, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. And there's nothing I can do to change that now. Fear and panic were written all over their faces, but for me this was just the beginning. It was the start of finally claiming my place, not as the invisible daughter, but as the woman who had earned the right to be seen. I didn't look back as I walked away from that house. The weight I'd carried for so long, the endless need to prove myself, the craving for approval that never came, finally lifted from my shoulders. I'd made it not because they finally saw me, but because I had finally seen myself. My phone buzzed with messages, my family scrambling to make sense of what I'd done, why I'd left so suddenly, and what that document really meant. I knew they were in shock, especially my father, but it didn't matter anymore. I'd already taken what I needed from them, the strength to stand on my own, to walk away from everything I once thought I couldn't live without. I wasn't the girl they used to overlook. I wasn't the daughter they could control or brush aside. I was my own person now, free from the weight of their expectations. As the night wore on, I knew they were probably still sitting there, staring at that paper, trying to wrap their heads around what had happened. My father, who had always dismissed my efforts, would finally realize what I was capable of, but it was too late for him to do anything about it. All those years of being treated as an afterthought had finally caught up with him. The house would never feel the same. The power dynamic had shifted, and I was no longer someone they could push around or ignore. My brothers, who had always fought for Dad's attention and never saw me as an equal, would have to accept that I wasn't just a background character in their story. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love or their recognition. I had built a life that didn't depend on any of them. I was strong, independent, and finally at peace. And when I looked in the mirror now, I saw someone who had fought for her place in the world. Someone who didn't need to look back to know she'd already won. The door was closed behind me. I had walked out, but more importantly, I had stepped into a future that was completely my own.